Hello, welcome back to the series of AWS training sessions. I am Sridhar Anchuri. So in this session, we are going to discuss about the concepts of VPC. So VPC is one of the service within AWS, and VPC stands for Virtual Private Network. And VPC is a virtual network within AWS environment. So VPC is associated to a region. So when we sign up for an AWS account, each region has a default VPC created by Amazon. So all this in the previous sessions we have created some of the EC2 instances. All these EC2 instances were created within the default VPC. That was the default networking private network which was being created by Amazon. But instead now we are going to see like how we can create our own network. We'll see how to create our own VPC, and we'll try to create the VPC. We are going to create the subnet and other networking resources, and then we'll spin up the instances within our own network. So VPC is a virtual network within AWS environment, and the VPC is associated to a region, and one region can have multiple VPCs. We can have a VPC for development environment, we can have a VPC for staging environment, we can have a VPC for SIT and UAT. We can have multiple VPCs, and each VPC is isolated from each other. So though we have the VPCs within the same region, the instances within those VPCs cannot talk to each other because they are isolated. And while creating a VPC, we have to specify the IP address range, the IPv4 address range, and which is called as like CADR, which stands for Classless Internet Domain Routing. So the VPC, the AWS account in this sample, in this design, I just have two different VPCs created in an AWS account in one of the regions. And we can have more than one VPC, and these VPCs are isolated to each other. And whenever we create a VPC, we have to specify the IPv4 address range. So IPv4 is a 4-octet number. So here we specify like 10.0.0.0. Each number represents an octet number, which can be a number from 0 to 255. So IP address ranges can be like 0.0.0.0 to 255.255.255.255, because each number can have a value from 0 to 255. So when we create a VPC, we have to specify the IP address range of our own network. It means all the instances or all the networking resources within this VPC should fall within this IP address range. So here we specify like I said, like each number represents an octet number which can have the value from 0 to 255. So here we are saying like the first VPC IP address range is like 10.0.0.0 by 16. 16 means it represents 2 bytes. So the first 2 bytes, 10.0, is fixed within our VPC range, meaning like this VPC can have the EC2 instances IP address ranging from 10.0.0.0 till 10.0.255.255. So the last two numbers can be from 0 to 255. As we have given 16, the first two digits 10.0 should be same for all the instances, for all the networking resources within the VPC. And second VPC, we are specifying the IP address range as 10.1.0.0 by 16. So here also we specify 16, and 16 means 2 bytes, and the first 2 bytes are 10.0. So in that case, in the second VPC, the EC2 instances or any other networking resources can have the IP ranges from 10.1.0.0 till 10.1.255.255. And we can have multiple VPCs within the region, and in each VPC we can have multiple subnets. Subnet is associated to an availability zone. Scope of the subnet is to an availability zone, and the scope of VPC is to the region. In a VPC, we can have multiple subnets, and for each subnet, we have to specify the CIDR range, IP address range as like we did it within VPC, and the CIDR range of the subnet should be within the VPC range. And we can have multiple subnets, and each subnet is associated to an availability zone. So this is about the VPC, and now we are going to see like how we can create a VPC on the AWS console. So now I'm in AWS console, so I'm going to the services and look for the service VPC. So I'm going to the VPC, and this is the VPC dashboard. So currently we have one VPC within the North Virginia region, and this is the default VPC which is being created by Amazon. So now all these days in the previous sessions we created EC2 instances within this VPC, and now we are going to create our own VPC. So either we can create the VPC by using the VPC wizard, or I'm going to create the VPC manually. So now we'll see how we can create our own VPC. So your VPCs will show the list of VPCs. Now this is the default VPC we have, and the CIDR range which we have is for with 172.31.0.0 by 16. So the default VPC has this CIDR range of this one. This means by 16 is 8 and 8, that's 2 bytes, and these are the 2 bytes. So the instances or all the networking resources within this VPC should be between 172.31.0.0 till 172.31.255.255. So because we have given 16, the first 2 bytes will be same, and this 2 octs can be from 0 to 255. So now instead of using our default VPC, I'm going to create a new VPC. To create a new VPC, I can just go with create VPC, and here the name of the VPC, I'm just saying my new VPC, and here this is where we have to specify the CIDR block. So I'm going to specify the CIDR range for one of the first VPCs like 10.0.0.0 by 16. 16 is 2 octs, 10.0. So when we create the subnets later on, the subnets IP address range should be within this IP address, meaning the subnets should also start with 10.0. So we'll see when we create the subnets. So I'm just going to create a VPC now. So my new VPC is going to be created now. Okay, my new VPC is the newly created VPC, and this is the CIDR range. So this is how we can create our own VPC. Now we just created a VPC, we just created our networking infrastructure, but only next thing is like we have to create the subnets within this VPC. So in order to configure the complete network, not only VPC and subnet, we have to configure the other networking resources which we are going to look into later on. But in this session, we are just only going to look into creating the VPC and subnets. So now I have a VPC created, and now I'm going to create a subnet, 2 subnets within this VPC. And to create a subnet, I can go to subnets. So here we already have the subnets, and all these subnets are associated to this default VPC. And all these subnets are associated to the availability zones, individual availability zones. So we are now in North Virginia region, and North Virginia region has these 5 availability zones. And for each availability zone, a subnet is being created. As I said, subnet is associated to an availability zone. The scope of the subnet is to availability zone, and the scope of VPC is to the region. So now I'm going to filter out by VPC. Here we can filter out. So now if I select the default VPC, all the subnets are under default VPC, and if I filter out by the newly created VPC, we don't have any subnets. I'm going to remove this filter and I'm going to create a new subnet. To create a new subnet, we can just click the button create subnet, and here we can specify the subnet name tag, subnet 1, and I'm saying this subnet should belong to my new VPC. This is the newly created VPC, and as soon as after selecting the VPC here, it shows the CADR address of this VPC, because we need this to enter the CADR block of the subnet, because this CADR block range should be within this VPC CADR. So I'm going to create a subnet within subnet 1, and here we can specify under which zone, in which zone we need to create a subnet, this subnet. So I'm going to configure this subnet in zone A. So later on, whenever we create EC2 instances within these subnets, the EC2 instances will be created within this availability zone. And here, coming to the IPv4 CADR block for the subnet, as I said, like the CADR block should be a subset of the VPC CADR. So this should be subset of the VPC CADR. So it should start with like 10.0 dot, I can specify 1.0 by 24. 24 is 3 bytes. So meaning like 10.0.1. So any EC2 instance which is created within this subnet will be within this CADR block, meaning the EC2 instances within subnet can have the IP address anywhere between 10.0.1.0 till 10.0.1.255. So, and I'm going to create the subnet 1. Okay, now the new subnet is being created with the CADR range, and I'm going to create another subnet within another zone. So now this subnet is created in the zone A, US East 1. US East 1 is the region. US East 1 indicates North Virginia, and zone A is the zone. So I'm going to create another subnet, and I'm going to name it as subnet 2. This subnet is going to be under this VPC, and I'm going to select the zone as now zone B. For high availability, we should spin up the resources within at least 2 availability zones. In case like if one availability zone goes down, the instances from another availability zone is still going to receive the traffic. So I'm going to select another availability zone, that is zone B, and the CADR block should be within this one, and it shouldn't conflict with the other subnets. So for the previous subnet we have given as 10.0.1. So for this subnet I'm going to give as 10.0.2.0. And if we have another subnet, if we create another subnet, subnet 3, we can specify like 10.0.3.0 by 24 and yes, create. So another subnet is going to be created within subnet 2. So now if I filter out by the newly created VPC, I should see the 2 subnets, the subnet 1 and subnet 2 within this IP address, like 10.0.1.0 by 24 and 10.0.2.0 by 24. So this is the basic concepts about creating the VPC and subnet. And in the next session, I'm going to show you like how we can create other networking resources like internet gateways, network ACLs, routing, etc. And that's all for today. See you in the next session.